Welcome to another episode of Critic.Reading.Writing. My name is Quayson, and I am Professor of English and Chair of the Department of African and African American Studies at Stanford University. In this episode, we'll be exploring the degree to which Beckett's aesthetics of disability is generated out of the different relations between the body, the stressed embodiment, and the futility of meaning-making in his work. This can be seen as the inescapable building blocks of the elusive significations of his texts. While we shall place specific focus on Murphy, this novel must be understood in the context of the wider body of Beckett's oeuvre, where his disability aesthetics is worked out in different directions. Modes of distressed embodiment register a central and non-negotiable crisis for Beckett's characters. In Happy Days, Winnie is buried up to her waist in a mound at the center of the stage. Her half-burial is the simultaneous invocation of womb and tomb that gives visual credence to the sin of having been born, as Ronan MacDonald points out in Tragedy and Irish Literature. Sing O'Casey Beckett. In Waiting for Godot, Vladimir suffers from a painful hernia, while in Endgame, Ham is confined to a wheelchair. Molloy seems to have one leg slightly shorter than the other, while Murphy, Clove, and Watt appear to be on different points on the autistic spectrum. This is to be seen in their penchant for routine and repetition, and their difficulty in relating to others on a basic emotional level. Watt hears voices singing, crying, stating, murmuring things unintelligible in his ear. Now these voices, sometimes they sang only, and sometimes they cried only, and sometimes they stated only, and sometimes they murmured only, and sometimes they sang and cried, and sometimes they sang and stated, and sometimes they sang and murmured, and sometimes they stated and murmured, and sometimes they sang and cried and stated, and sometimes they sang and cried and murmured, and so on and so forth, as if his mind itself was a theater of changeable and distracting character parts. And yet, because in Beckett we are almost never given the precise cause of the character's impairments, their mode of distressed embodiment also serves to destabilize any ready links that we might seek to establish between cause and effect. All we are left with are the idiosyncratic gestures by which the characters attempt and repeatedly fail to make sense of the embodied conditions in which they are trapped. The quest of Beckett's characters for meaning is repeatedly frustrated, and this is accompanied by various gestures and bodily postures as an aspect of that frustration. We need only think of Vladimir and Estragon's frequent peering into their bowler hats, Clove's stiff walk, Ham's regular yawns, Molloy's neurotic distribution of sucking stones in his 4 pockets so as not to suck the same 2 stones in succession, and Murphy's habit of tying himself with 7 scarves to his rocking chair and rocking himself into oblivion to see that the negotiation of distressed embodiment is indeed a central concern for Beckett's characters. As we see repeatedly in his work, distressed embodiment is often also connected to the quest for meaning. Significant in this respect is the form of what might be described as the analogical quest, seen especially in the novel Murphy, but in various degrees also in Molloy and the Unnameable, among others. Aspects of autistic spectrum disorders, but especially of Asperger syndrome, are pertinent to an analysis of Murphy's analogical quests. Asperger syndrome, or AS, is generally marked by fluent, if unusual, speech, along with different degrees of social ineptitude and a fascination with patterns and systems, be they linguistic, numeric, or alphanumeric. Of the 11 features of persons with AS discussed by Simon Baron-Cohen in his book Mindblindness, an essay on autism and theory of mind, and in various other publications, the most pertinent to a reading of Murphy are 1. Their fascination with systems, be they simple, such as light switches or water taps, a little bit more complex, such as weather fronts, or abstract, such as mathematics. 2. Their tendency to follow their own desires and beliefs rather than paying attention to or indeed acknowledging others' desires and beliefs. And 3. Their preference for experiences that are controllable rather than unpredictable. Aligned with their fascination with systems is also a strong attraction towards repetition, whether in patterns and systems or of rhythmic actions of particular kinds, something that is arguably inherent in patterns and systems in the first place. The overarching and central aspect of the autistic Asperger syndrome continuum, however, is silence and lack of communication. While these features may be said to be common in different degrees to many non-autistic people, what differentiates the autist is the fact that the features are mutually reinforcing and become central aspects of the autist's identity as such. Stillness and the relentless quest for patterns and systems are central aspects of Murphy's character and provide an important dimension to what we see as his autistic spectrum disorder. We are provided with two main nodal points for exploring this fascination. First is Murphy's fixation with his lunch biscuits and the permutations in which he considers eating them. And second is the game of chess with Mr. Endon towards the end of the novel. The 5 biscuits Murphy takes out for daily lunch comprise a ginger, an Osborne, a digestive, a petit beurre, and one anonymous. These present a peculiar problem for him, which is related to the variety of sequences in which he might ingest them so that he can achieve the highest number of permutations. But this is hampered by the fact that he always eats the ginger biscuit first. This is despite recognizing that were he to take the final step and overcome his infatuation to the ginger, then the assortment would spring to life before him, dancing the radiant measure of its total permutability, edible in 120 ways. The biscuits are seen by Murphy not as mere things to be digested, but as ciphers of concealed numeric patterns. Thus, he does not aim to free himself from desire. Rather, his desire is precisely to translate the mundane act of eating the biscuits into an avenue for accessing infinite mathematical possibilities. One is reminded of Molloy's intent effort at distributing his 6 sucking stones among his 4 pockets so that he will be able to suck each stone in sequence but without repetition. It is a major mathematical conundrum that runs continuously for several pages of that novel. Of the various loci of patterns within the novel, it is the game of chess that has attracted the most critical attention, and for good reason. It takes place on Murphy's first night shift at the Magdalene Mental Mercy Seat, the MMM, when his duties involve making rounds of the ward at regular intervals and turning the lights on and off in the patient's cells to ascertain that none of the inmates has come to harm in the interval between the inspections. The purpose of turning the light switches is also to record each cell visit on the electric switchboard located in his boss Baum's apartment. On arriving at Mr. Endon's cell, a strange sight meets Murphy's eyes. Mr. Endon, an impeccable and brilliant figurine in his scarlet gown, his crest a gush of vivid white against the black shag, squatted tailor fashion on the head of his bed, holding his left foot in his right hand and in his left hand his right foot. The purple pulaines were on his feet and the rings were on his fingers. The light spurted off Mr. Endon north, south, east, west, and in 56 other directions. The sheet stretched away before him, as smooth and taut as a groaning wife's belly, and on it a game of chess was set up. The little blue and olive face, wearing an expression of winsome fiat, was upturned to the Judas. In the game of chess that follows, the mild schizophrenic Mr. Endon plays black and Murphy white. Since the two of them have already been conducting intermittent games of chess during the course of Murphy's daylight rounds of the ward, the nocturnal setup is not entirely surprising. What is surprising is the peculiar character of the game they play on this occasion. Endon is interested only in constructing a private system of play with his black pieces. This is not something that Murphy realizes until it is too late. Despite opening with white, Murphy ends up imitating Endon's moves, who plays in such a way as to ultimately return all of his black pieces to their starting positions on the back rank. The only pieces that cannot be so returned are the pawns, only 2 of which Endon moves. Murphy's imitation of Endon's chess moves operates at 2 levels simultaneously. First is at the level of the movement of the pieces themselves, and second is at the level of mirroring Endon's mind. As Taylor and Loffrey put it in Murphy's Surrender to Symmetry, the imperfect attempt at mirror symmetry is thus an expression of the relationship between black and white. It is also a comment on Endon and Murphy as individuals. Endon is pursuing temporal symmetry for its own sake. Murphy is committed to the pursuit of temporal symmetry because Endon is pursuing it, and to mirror symmetry because he is pursuing Endon. In attempting an imitation of Endon's moves, Murphy's engagement is not with the movements of the inanimate chess pieces, but with the movements of an animate mind, Endon's. However, Murphy's mimetic effort is inherently imperfect because he assumes that Endon is actually playing chess with him, Murphy, when in fact the system that Endon pursues is one of utter chaos, even if it is masked by way of the chess moves. Endon is not playing against white, but only using white's moves as a trigger for elaborating his exclusive and ultimately inimitable private system. Murphy resigns on the 43rd move. Not only is the game of chess the most significant focalization of Murphy's fixation with patterns and systems, it is also the point at which the narrative performs a series of switches and transfers along the entire rhetorical plane, and more specifically on the metonymic axis. And since it is the point at which Murphy, the autistic character, is pitted against Endon, the mild schizophrenic, it is also the juncture at which the process of analogical patterns becomes most pronounced. The conclusion of the game of chess is the moment when Murphy's emotional confusion is made fully evident, thus subtly tying autistic dynamic, emotion, and analogical quest together within a singular discursive ensemble. In the game of chess they play, Endon's mind may be said to replicate the hermetically sealed system dimension of Murphy's mental space that has been elaborated for us in chapter 6 of the novel. For despite playing against an opponent, what Endon does is essentially to use his opponent's moves as a cue for the elaboration of his own hermetic personal system, thus effacing the opponent and converting him into a mere function of Endon's own system. This exemplification of the system-like dimension of the mind of Murphy by Endon is crucial to what happens directly after their chess game, since it implies a displacement of significations along the metonymic axis, such that after the chess game, Murphy becomes Endon, and Endon, Murphy. Directly after Murphy resigns from the chess game, he is overwhelmed by an irresistible desire to sleep. He drops his head amongst the chess pieces, perceiving as he does so a series of fragmentary images not dissimilar to what exists in the dark zone of his own mind, which has already been described in some detail in chapter 6 of the novel. It is not clear how long Murphy sleeps, but when he wakes up in the familiar variety of stenches, asperities, ear splitters, and eye closers, Mr. Endon has gone missing. Now, for anyone with experience of playing chess, Murphy's sudden slumber is extraordinary. Chess is the direct opposite of a soporific. Rather, it tends to arouse the mind. Whether they win or lose, chess players generally tend to mentally replay the game or parts of it after it ends, so as to review their strengths and weaknesses. The hypnotic sleep Murphy falls into should, however, not be taken simply as an unrealistic detail, for it also marks what I think is a subtle yet decisive shift in the largely realist discourse that has been operational up to this point in the novel. On escaping the cell, Endon had been drifting about the corridors, pressing here a light switch and there an indicator, in a way that seemed haphazard, but was in fact determined by a mental past pattern as precise as any of those governed by chess. Murphy found him in the south transept, gracefully stationed before the hypomaniac's pad, ringing the changes on the various ways in which the indicator could be pressed and the light turned on and off. Beginning with the light turned off to begin with, he had lit, indicated, extinguished, lit, extinguished, indicated, indicated, lit, extinguished. Continuing then with the light turned on to begin with, he had extinguished, lit, indicated, extinguished, indicated, lit, indicated, extinguished, and was seriously thinking of lighting when Murphy stayed his hand. Mr. Enden is here performing Murphy's role after the articulation of the imperturbable symmetry of his mind in the chess game they had just completed. He has effectively switched places with Murphy across the chessboard, whose discursive function in the narrative has partially been to enable the initiation of the metonymic transfers between them and the progressive shaping of the discursive circle that will follow the game, where Murphy wants to be analogically like Enden, and Enden performs the role of Murphy, and yet they are never quite analogically the same because Enden does not recognize Murphy as he is playing chess with him, but only himself, Enden. If this sounds confusing, it is because it really is confusing. Reading that part of the novel requires especially close attention to detail. Murphy's attempt to arrive at a form of analogical validation through the game of chess ends up in failure. The collapse of Murphy's analogical quest is of a piece with what we might describe as a hermeneutical delirium. Hermeneutical delirium ramifies both at the level of interactions between the characters in the novel and between us and the text we are reading, in such a way as to persistently frustrate any attempts at meaning making. We see similar examples of hermeneutical delirium in texts such as the short stories of Georges Louis Borges, or in Italo Calvino's Invisible Cities, as well as in William Faulkner's Absalom, Absalom, and Toni Morrison's Beloved, along with many other books. But the defeat or frustration of the quest for meaning situates hermeneutical delirium as a product of repeated circling, as though to replicate the slow going of time at the level of textual signification itself. When Murphy lies on the grass after the chess game and attempts to recall images of his friends and others he has known, it is as if in an attempt to identify a possible mode of integration into the social world of family and friends, different from what he had just attempted with his futile identification with Mr. Enden. But he fails here too, for in the ultimate instance, whatever principle the sociality represents cannot replicate the desire for patterns that is the first principle of the autistic spectrum disorder that Murphy bears. André Malraux once noted that solitude often necessitates the quest for another, like one's own lonely self. And yet, in the autist's case, the quest is always going to be defeated because what is required is the analogical reflection of patterns and not simply of the alterity of the other. Murphy's accidental death at the end of the novel is only a formal discursive confirmation of what had already taken place inside his autistic mind in the first place. Beckett's disability aesthetics is thus grounded on a series of enigmas, the starting point of which is the very state of distressed embodiment, which we find not only in Murphy, but in all of his novels and plays. Thank you. Please remember to check out the suggested readings in the episode's description. And if you like this episode, give a thumbs up, subscribe and share, hit the notifications bell so that you do not miss out on any upcoming episodes. And enter your comments in the section below. See you next week.